Idealism denies the reality of external objects independent of the knowing minds. So, first, we need to understand that idealism denies the independence of the external objects that exist independently of the knowing or perceiving minds. So, according to idealism, there are no external objects in the world, and everything that exists is a creation of the mind. So, without the mind, nothing really exists in reality. So, the external objects are not necessarily real as we see them existing in the world around us. The mind is the primary reality. Either there are no external objects or they are mind dependent. So, in idealism, the mind becomes the primary reality. So, the external objects and their qualities do not matter in idealism because, according to it, the mind is the whole and it creates all other ideas and realities that we see in the world around us. So, external objects that exist independently of the minds are not necessarily real, and the mind is the only primary reality. And either there are no external objects at all, everything that we see is a creation of the perceiving or knowing mind, or it may be that the objects that we see around ourselves are mind dependent and therefore they are not necessarily real. And that is that our ideas are not representations of external objects independent of minds. So, our ideas are not necessarily the representations of the external objects independent of the minds, but rather everything is a creation of the mind because it's the primary reality. And this is the doctrine of idealism. It regards the reality as ideal or mind dependent. So, according to idealism, the reality is mind dependent. Uh, so, it's ideal. Reality is ideal and it's dependent upon the mind as according to idealism. It takes various forms: subjective idealism, phenomenalistic idealism, and objective idealism are its main forms. So, idealism can be divided into three main branches, that is, subjective idealism, phenomenalistic idealism, and objective idealism are the main forms. And according to subjective idealism, uh, subjective idealism denies the existence of the external objects and reduces them to the subjective ideas of the finite minds that perceive them. So, subjective idealism directly denies the existence of the external objects and reduces them to the subjective ideas of the finite minds that perceive them. So, our minds perceive the ideas of the objects that we see around ourselves, and therefore they are not real. The so-called external objects are sensations produced in the finite minds by God according to some fixed laws. So, the so-called external objects of the world are only are only ideas or sensations that are produced in the finite minds by God in accordance with some fixed laws. So, God creates sensations or ideas of the objects in the minds, and therefore we see them in reality, and therefore they are not real. The so called external objects are produced in the mind by God. Berkeley is an advocate of subjective idealism. He denies the existence of the external world. So, George Berkeley is an advocate of subjective idealism and he has written extensively on the philosophy of subjective idealism, and he denies the existence of the external world. he admits the existence of God and the finite minds only. So, because Berkeley is an advocate of subjective idealism, he has denied the existence of the external world, and he admits the existence of God and the finite minds, which obviously perceive the other objects. Kant is an exponent of phenomenalistic idealism. So Immanuel Kant comes up as an exponent or advocate of phenomenalistic idealism. He does not deny the existence of things in themselves or noumena, but he regards them as unknown and unknowable. So, according to Kant, there are things in themselves which he calls noumena. But he also says that they cannot be known. Things in themselves or noumena are unknown and unknowable realities. And that's phenomenalistic idealism. We can know only their phenomenal appearances through our own form and categories. So, as proposed by Kant, things in themselves or noumena can only be known by their appearances or phenomenal structure through our own form and categories. Now, Hegel, another German philosopher, was an advocate of objective idealism. So Hegel was the creator of objective idealism. He admits the reality of the world, but he regards it as an outward expression of the absolute mind. So Hegel, being an advocate of objective idealism, admits the reality of the external objective world, but he also says and regards it or the world as an outward expression of the absolute mind. So the absolute mind is able to create the external objective world which we see around ourselves. It is independent of the finite mind of God. So the absolute mind goes beyond and transcends the finite minds created by God, and therefore it is superior to the mind of God, and therefore it sees the objects around itself, and it is the object of the external world and universal consciousness. So it is the absolute mind is independent of the finite mind of God, and it is the object of the external and universal consciousness. So there is an external and universal consciousness which is able to produce the absolute mind in us, which is beyond and greater than the finite mind of God. There is no God without the world, and there is no world without God. So he also says that there is no God without the world. So the world is necessary for God, and so is God necessary for the world. The finite minds are the finite reproductions of God through the limiting adjuncts of the physical organisms. So the finite minds of God are the finite reproductions of God through the limiting adjuncts of the physical organisms. So that's that. So the world is intelligible to them. The world is actually comprehensible and intelligible to the finite minds of God, or the finite expressions created by the gods. But then the absolute mind is able to acknowledge and recognize the existence of the external objective world. It is real as well as ideal. So according to Hegel, the external world is both real and ideal at the same time. The absolute mind is capable of grasping, comprehending, and seeing the external world and its objects, and the finite mind is the creation of God, which is not necessarily able to see the world as it is and denies its existence because it is limited. And it is real because it exists independently of the finite minds. So the world is real according to objective idealism and Hegel because it exists independently of the finite minds, and can only be perceived by the absolute mind, which is the result of the universal consciousness. And that's that. It is real because it is rational in its constitution and an expression of the absolute mind. So the external world is real because it is rational in its constitution and also an expression of the absolute mind. So the absolute mind is able to see the external world in its entirety because it is greater than the finite minds created by the God. The finite minds are only able to see limited realities and not necessarily the objective realities, but only the absolute mind is capable of seeing everything, the objects, the phenomena, the material, things in themselves or noumena, the unknown, unknowable objects as well. So the external world is real because it exists independently of the finite minds of God and because it is rational in its constitution and an expression of the absolute mind. So the external world is real because it is also an expression of the higher, greater absolute mind, which is obviously there with us every single time, as said by Hegel.